You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. My guest today is Amos Clifford, a wilderness guide, mentor, and educator. Amos is the founder of Shinrin-yoku, and I hope I'm saying that right, Amos.org, an organization dedicated to the promotion of Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing. And listeners, you'll find out what that is in just a few moments. Amos is also interested in and promoting other forms of nature immersion therapy. So welcome, Amos, to Sustainable World Radio.
Thank you, Jill.
Can you tell our listeners a bit about this type of work that you're doing, and especially the Shinrin-yoku work, and maybe start with explaining what that term means?
One of the things that's important to realize is that it's different from most of what we're used to in this culture for nature connection. So I would say we have several things we do that we're very familiar with in this culture. One is adventure in nature, which is great. Rock climbing, mountain biking, trail running, backpacking, all of those things, kayaking, wonderful experiences that can be really helpful. That's not what Shinrin-yoku is about. Another experience is naturalist-style education. So this is when you go to, say, a botanical garden, or you go out on a hike with a resident naturalist, and they know a tremendous amount about plants. They know the names of the species, they know the families, they know some of the ecological relationships, and they give these huge downloads of information. And a lot of times the experience that people will have on the trail in getting these downloads is it's really interesting, it's really fascinating, it's more than I can take in. I'm going to forget most of it very soon. I might be furiously taking notes and hardly noticing the environment around me. Now, I don't want to say that kind of education is a bad thing. I really value my naturalist knowledge, and I'm constantly adding to it. There's maybe a third category that is also not Shinrin-yoku, and it's another nature connection category, and it has to do with things like learning tracking, learning bird language, learning primitive skills like how to use the plants for medicines or for tools or for basketry, really understanding the ways that animals live in the environment. And all of that stuff is deeply, deeply nature connected. And yet it also is not what we're doing with the forest therapy.
I was laughing when you were talking about the docent training, because I was on one of those guided plant walks, and I was frantic with my iPhone taking photos of the plants and notes, trying to remember and then I finally had to put it away because I was too stressed out to enjoy the walk.
Right,
so
right.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
And I know it too, because I've been there too. But with the forest therapy, what we do is we take another strategy that I think is complementary to those strategies, to the adventure education, to the wilderness and primitive skills, and to the naturalist education. And this forest therapy is about direct connection through the senses. And so for me, a lot of it is informed by many years of Zen practice, where there's a lot of simply sitting still and noticing what's going on, and just noticing the flow of what's going on in the environment. I believe that the early Zen practitioners, going back to the Buddha and back to in the Chan practices in China, started by Bodhidharma, that then morphed into Zen in Japan, those people were outside. They were sitting under trees. They were sitting in forests. They were wandering. They were profoundly nature-connected people. And so the good things that were happening in their minds and in their bodies had to do not just with sitting still, but they had to do with being really attuned in a very beautiful and sensory and even sensuous way to the natural landscapes around them and the natural cycles of the seasons and the natural cycles of their bodies. And so Shinrin-yoku is much more aligned with that way of being in the forest. To give you an example, this is just an incredibly simple, no-brainer thing to do, but also very much an edge for many people in our culture. One of the things we do as Shinrin-yoku guides is we slow people down. So I'll begin a walk. I'll say, I'm going to walk up through this meadow, and I'm going to set the pace. And just walk along and wander, but stay back behind me so that you get used to this pace. And I'll walk very slowly. I'll give another invitation too, like I'll give them something to do with their mind. So typically one of the things that I love to do to begin a walk is to walk slowly and simply notice what is in motion in the environment. Try this sometime when you're out. Just walk slowly, look around you, notice how the trees are moving, how the grasses are moving, maybe there's little pieces of fluff going in the air or cobwebs. How are the bugs moving? How are the birds moving? Just noticing that as you're moving slowly, and give yourself 10 or 15 minutes of doing that. And what happens is that starts recalibrating your awareness so that you're more attuned to the ambient energy level that's in the environment around you.
It's so relaxing.
Right. Unless perhaps the ambient energy level is really exciting. What if you're doing this in a storm and the rain is moving horizontally and the trees are swaying heavily and the waters are really rushing in that creek? Then it could be really energizing, right? Mm-hmm. It's more about what is the ambient energy in the environment and how do I come into a place of harmony with that. Most of the time it is very relaxing. So simply slowing people down is really a critical first part of the forest immersion. And then as we move on, we move through a series of invitations. So notice I'm using the word invitation. These are not exercises. They're activities, but we very, very specifically use the word invitation. And part of that sense of invitation is that if you find yourself efforting too hard, let it go. So we'll use invitations to connect with what is around you, cycling through all the senses, through touch, through vision, through hearing, through the sense of taste. Very often we'll spend time with plants that we can taste, but also as we do this practice, we start becoming attuned to the taste of the air as we're breathing it, and also the sense of smell, the different smells. And one of the realizations we have is that even those of us who have carried the story that my sense of smell is really dull, we start realizing that no, actually, we discriminate very many different kinds of smells. We just do that naturally, and we tend to not notice it, so we start noticing that. So we go through those 5 basic senses, and then very often we'll move into additional senses besides those. So an example would be what's called proprioceptive, and you can think of this as your felt body sense. Like if you move your arm through space, you have that sense of movement. If you're moving forward quickly and then you stop, you have a sense of acceleration and deceleration. So we can just very easily tune into some of those senses as we're moving through the landscapes. And that has a very interesting effect of helping us feel the landscape in a new way. And then we have 4 or 5 other senses that we go into routinely as well on these walks.
Wow. So where do you take people to do forest immersion or forest bathing?
So The environments I've done this in range from little pocket parks in noisy city locations to very beautiful, isolated, old-growth redwood forests, state parks, regional parks, senior retirement center here in Santa Rosa. We've done these walks with the elderly residents there, many of whom are using walkers. We've just used the raised flower beds in their garden area. A small garden of raised flower beds, we can do easily a 45-minute to hour-long, very in-depth sensory immersion. And that's one of the things about these walks is we're not out hiking. You know, my typical walk will go 3, maybe 4 hours. We always go less than a mile. Sometimes we only get a quarter mile. And it doesn't feel like we're bored. You know, it feels very engaged and intense and interesting all the way along.
So that's very different from hiking and from people racing along with our iPods and on our cell phones and being distracted. So it sounds like it's a practice of mindfulness in nature.
Yeah, we see this all the time. We see people zooming by with the headset in as we're doing this walk. But yeah, you bring up mindfulness. And so what I want to say is that we very quickly go into a state of being very mindfully present. As a guide, I don't usually say this in the beginning. I don't say what we're going to do is meditation or we're going to go into a mindfulness meditation as we walk. The reason I don't do that is because as a longtime meditator and teacher of meditation, one of the things that I've learned is that when you bring up the meditation word in our culture, people will start efforting around that in a particular way that's not helpful. So it's really easier to go into these deep states if no one's calling attention to it and you're simply doing it. So I can give you an example of how that works. At least my view of how that works is our normal cultural state of consciousness is based on this notion that mind and body are two separate things. And we experience that in the sense of our mind is very often not present where our body is. So we'll be thinking about the future, about the past, about some kind of preoccupation we have with something else. And this is a really kind of ordinary, disintegrated state in our culture. And it's also a state that is associated with high levels of stress and the harmful effects of stress on our bodies. If we're walking down a trail, say, and you can do this, this is super easy, right? You can go outside wherever you are right now and find the nearest tree and simply walk up to that tree and put your hand on that tree and start feeling the sensations of that tree on your hand. As soon as you put your attention on those sensations that are on your hand and on that tree, you come into a more integrated state. Your mind and your body are in the same location in that moment. So automatically you're practicing mindfulness. And I suspect that forest therapy is perhaps, for many of us, a much more accessible way to mindfulness meditative states than most of what's offered out there, you know, like sitting in the meditation halls or going to mindfulness classes or something like that, all of which is really helpful. I don't want to in any way imply that that's not helpful stuff, but there's this naturalness to doing it in forest therapy that just gets people into these sustained mindful states for a long period of time. And one of the things that we avoid when we're doing this is we avoid going into our heads, right? So let's say I'm going back to this example of simply feeling a texture of a tree or of the dirt, or my hand is in the water of a stream, or wherever I'm feeling that texture. One of the things that that I invite people to do and invite myself to do is to see if I can experience that without naming or explanation, to simply notice as directly as possible what the sensory qualities of that are. And it can be a little tricky to do this without naming because we want to describe those. We want to say, oh, it's rough, it's cold, it's soft. We want to have those kinds of words, and that's all fine. And yet there's also something even more direct, something that happens before those words. And we get little moments and glimpses of that as we're moving through the forest therapy experience. Every time we do that, we're in a state of deep mindfulness.
I know that state. I've been in that state just from being out in nature. And what, in your opinion, Amos, is actually working on us? What part of nature is working on us? Is it the essential oils in the plants and trees? Is it the energy of the plants and trees? What, in your opinion, is actually bringing us into that deep, relaxed state?
Well, I think it's multiple things, So if you look at the Japanese research, say, on forest therapy, one of the things that they are emphasizing is the physiological effects. So they're able to measure all these great effects in our bodies, like cortisol levels are reduced very quickly. A 2-hour walk, your cortisol is down, and that's associated with stress, right? The heart rate variability, there's improvements in that. That's an indicator of the nervous system coming into harmony. There's many effects like that are physiological. And because they're measuring physiological effects, I think they're looking for physiological explanations. So one of the things that they look at are the phytoncides and other chemicals that are emitted by trees. So anytime, everybody knows this, you're in a pine forest and you smell that beautiful piney smell, and a lot of that is from these chemicals that are called phytoncides. And so, this works, they hypothesize, in similar ways to aromatherapy, that whatever the tiny molecular influences are, as we breathe those in, they're just good for us. And this makes a lot of sense. We evolved in forest environments. Of course, we're going to be attuned to that. So that's a physiological kind of explanations. Then there's other explanations like the mindfulness explanation, just simply bringing mind and body into harmony and being present is something that is de-stressing, that can be deeply relaxing. And any time we get away from stress and we start relaxing, that's really good for our bodies. So that's another one. Now, I think for me, very interesting hypothesis on this is simply relational. So by relational, what I mean is it's a little bit like the good medical benefits of having friends and being in stable relationships with family or with partners. We know that when we're in good relationships with friends, that just generally supports our sense of well-being and health. And lots of science on that. Well, when we're in good relationship with the more than human world, I think that's also comes into play there too. So again, we evolved as a species deeply in relationship with the world around us. Our ancestors, not that many generations ago, knew intimately the cycles of the seasons. They could say right now what phase the moon is in, and I'm guessing that many of your listeners would not be able to say that right off the top of their head, what phase the moon is in. They knew as individuals the birds who lived in their neighborhood. They used and relied upon the forests and the plants and the animals for medicine, for food, and so on. And so this is a way of being deeply, deeply in relationship with the world around us. And I suspect that this sense of deep relationship is like being at home, like that comfortable way of being at home. And that's much of how I experience the forest therapy. I want to say, though, that for me, the forest therapy is one of the practices I use for that. So another one is one we incorporate on forest therapy walks. It's a very simple practice called sit spot, and I highly recommend this to any of your listeners. It just consists of finding a place outside where you can sit on a regular basis for 20 or 30 minutes. It could even be like your front porch. But if there's a place that you can get to easily that's more natural, that's a little bit outside of the human-built environment, if you just go and sit there on a regular basis, over time, the animals that live there get to know you, and they start acting naturally around you. And over time, you get to know them, and you start knowing individual birds, and you start knowing like who your local critters are. So I have a little sit spot outside my house. I'm fortunate to live in a very beautiful place on Sonoma Mountain. And I walk outside my kitchen and I sit under the oak tree, and I have experiences like, I know when the fox pups have been born. I can hear them. I watched their mother run and leap into a fruit tree to harvest something for them. Maybe it's a bird egg. I know when the kites have come back and where they nest. I know my red-tailed hawk that lives in the pine trees 100 yards to the north. And all of those things for me are just very profoundly connected. And the forest therapy helps introduce us to that kind of deeply connected experience.
It's getting to know our relatives again.
Right. And so, we talk about, in our culture, we have this idea of natural resources. And I want to draw one of those big red circles with the slash through it over the word natural resource. Because when we view it that way, it's the subtle message is, all of this stuff is here for us to use. What I want to replace that with is the Lakota term, all my relations, all our relations. And that's the term of deep knowing. That's the term where we can find the roots of the wisdom that we need now if we're going to survive as a species. It's not natural resources. When we view it as natural resources, that's when things like mountaintop removal happens. That's when things like fracking happens. That's when things like building dams happens. All of those kinds of things. That's when we clear cut forests because we're viewing them as resources. But if we viewed them as all my relations, we would not be removing mountaintops. We would not be clear cutting forests. We would not be doing industrial factory farming and all these other things that are very destructive to the environment. This is how I start my little handbook of Shinrin-yoku that I wrote. Is my core premise is that in order for us to become a sustainable species, we must be in relationship with nature. We must actually be in this visceral sense of all my relations when we're walking through the world. Not as a theory, but as a felt experience. Without that, all the clever strategies that we come up with to be sustainable will be subtly flawed in ways that will be our undoing.
I love the idea of cultivating a better relationship with nature, because really, if we're in a relationship with someone and we give them the silent treatment, like for years of our life, how good of a relationship you're going to have, right? People are just disconnected. And so my question was going to be, what about someone that's living in a very urban environment and they love what you're saying? What can they do to cultivate a better relationship with nature?
Well, I would say get outside in your city and find the little natural pockets. And one of the things that you can do, this is another really connected practice, it's called tending, place tending. Find a place and tend it. And so that could be like just a little part of a park. It could be, your front yard. It could be even as small as an outdoor flower pot, and start tending that place. And really do it from a perspective of service and of inquiry and of curiosity. So what is it as I tend this place? What happens? And a near universal experience on this is that after you've been tending a place for a while, it's like a little switch gets thrown. And you have this moment, this epiphany, where you say, wait a minute, who's tending who here? Because you get the place itself is supporting you. You get the aliveness of that. That is when you're starting to go into deep nature connection, and you don't need to be in the wilderness to do it. Pay attention to the birds, just the birds. Wherever you live, there are birds there. Just spend 20 minutes sitting more or less still. I'm not saying hold still and rigid, but just, kind of sit in a relaxed way somewhere. It takes about 20 minutes. The reason we say 20 minutes is it takes about that long for the animals in our environment to come back to baseline. When a person comes out, they know people were apex predators in their world. They're a little bit alarmed. We come out, they change their behavior. We sit around for about 20 minutes, and they start saying, okay, well, I guess that person's okay. And they start behaving normally again. And so give it about 20 minutes and just allow them to start responding to the environment around you in a way that's more natural. That can be very connective. If you live say you're on the 10th floor of a high-rise building in an urban environment, if you're lucky to have a little balcony, go sit out on the balcony and do that. See what happens.
Great. So you can pretty much do it anywhere. And one thing that I would love for listeners to be aware of is that Japan and I believe the US and South Korea are doing a lot of studies on, and this is in particular forest bathing or Shinrin-yoku, and they're finding out the benefits are just phenomenal. The lowered blood pressure, reduced cortisol, reduced stress hormone levels, less anger, reduced anger and depression, and more vigor. And I think you write about this on your blog and website, which is Shinrin-yoku, which is, could you spell that for our listeners and give them your website?
It's like Shin, Shinrin, Shin, so it's spelled like Shinrin, but pronounced more like Shindin, and then hyphen, and then Yoku, Yoku.
And .org, right?
And then another website that might be a little easier to remember is just NFTG. That's Nature Forest Therapy Guide, NFTG.org. So that's the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy Guides and Programs. And that's actually the organization that I do the training through.
For people to be aware, too, that some of the studies, you can research this, and one study in Japan showed that forest bathing or taking people out into the forest increased white blood cell counts, NK cells, 40%.
Yeah, natural killer cells that have a lot to do with our immune response and also our resistance to cancers. So that's one of the really very compelling results, and that can happen. The NK cell increase starts happening in about 2 hours. To really get a solid dose of that that's going to persist, they recommend kind of a weekend trip, go out and spend a lot of time in the forest and or do a repetition, do this once a week for a while.
Forest bathing or forest therapy sounds like a very accessible way for people of all fitness levels to gain a connection with nature. I think some people are intimidated by the idea of, oh my gosh, I have to put on a backpack and hiking shoes and hike out in the middle of nowhere to connect with nature. So is this something that people of all fitness levels can participate in?
Absolutely. Like I was talking about the people at the retirement home who have walkers, who are out moving very slowly. One of my favorite experiences so far has been a woman signed up for one of these walks, and she said, I am morbidly obese. Do you think I can do one of these walks? And I said, are you able to walk at all? She said, yes. And I said, come and do the walk, and we will adjust as needed to support you. And I had a group of about, maybe 8 people that day that came. And that woman walked a half mile, and it was an incredible experience for her and for the whole group. For me, I personally felt a lot of joy in seeing that here was someone who would not consider signing up for any other kind of outdoor experience, who was able to find the courage to come and do this. And I've heard this from a number of people. Like I ask people, why did you sign up for this today? So part of what I hear from people is that the hikes that are normally offered are more than they're confident. Then another thing that I hear from women is that they often don't feel safe unless they're in a group. Then another thing that I've heard sometimes is people are just intrigued because it's a different kind of experience from the naturalist walks and so on. And I very often get people who have exhausted every naturalist walk in the in the neighborhood. I have to restrain them. I have to say, listen, as we're on the walk, please don't name plants or explain things. All right, let's just stay in a different experience. Right?
It's like take off your heart monitor and your the thing that measures your steps.
The place I guide the most is called Sugarloaf Ridge State Park. It's up near the town of Kenwood, which is in the Sonoma Valley. And it's a beautiful little park, and it's very accessible. And one of the nice things about it is that cell phones don't work up there. So there's no reception. So I don't even have to deal with it. But I tell you, at the beginning of all the walks, I do ask people to turn their phones off and to take a little holiday from their screens while we're on the walk. Another thing we'll do often to start a walk is we'll do a little worry stone pile. And so what we do is I just invite everyone to look around for a stone, something that can hold a worry for them, and then to share, this is something I might be preoccupied with, something that might come into my mind and tend to distract me during the day, something I'm worried about at home or at work. And they can name silently or out loud what that is and put their little stone down and make a little pile of worry stones. And then I'd suggest to people, look, when you're out on the trail, if that comes up, just remember you've got that stone down there holding it, and it holds it for you. Your worry is safe. It will be there when you come back. So you can just leave that behind. Now, it may change by the time you come back, or you may feel that you don't need to pick it up, but you know what? You're totally welcome to pick that up at the end. I've heard from many people when we do that worry stone that it's really effective. Their worries come up, they remember the stone, the worry goes away, and they come right back into the moment.
That's fabulous. I love that. That. Now, in Japan and I think a few other countries around the world, they're spending a lot of money, they're researching this, and they're building forest therapy trails and sites. Do you foresee this happening worldwide as the information about this gets out? And do you think this is an effective way, another way we can conserve or preserve land and natural sites?
That's really the mission. I mean, that's the mission I'm on. It's the mission of the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy Guides and Programs, is as a long-time nature connection wilderness guide, I really have been carrying this question, what can I do to connect as many people as possible with nature in a meaningful way? So, for example, I could lead vision fasts, very powerful, 12 days, you're out on your own within that 12-day container, you'll be out on your own somewhere from 3 to 4 days and nights fasting, and you will definitely have a powerful connection with the more than human world when you do that. Maybe 1,000th of 1% of the population would be even interested in that, right? So I feel like, well, that's not really where I want to guide in these years. I want to figure out a way to maximize this. Along comes information about Shinrin-yoku. They're integrating this into their healthcare system. So I start wondering, what would it be like to mobilize the largest referral network in the nation and probably in many other nations to get people out connecting with nature? What would that be like? And so the goal of the association and of my work is to integrate forest therapy into the healthcare system in the United States and to support that in other countries as best we can, as resources permit. And so one of the primary strategies to do that is I'm putting myself in the shoes of a physician, I'm hoping. And I have a physician on my advisory board, so I've had this discussion with her also. What does a physician need to feel comfortable writing a prescription to someone to go spend time in nature?
I love
Well, some physicians just do that. They're just like, yeah, you know how to do that, right? But others may be held back a little bit from some concerns, like, are they going to be able to do this safely? What happens if I send them out into nature and they break a leg, and then am I somehow liable? Something like that. One of our strategies to respond to that is let's train and certify forest therapy guides. And let's have a certification process that's rigorous enough, that's based on a clear assessment of knowledge and competencies based on clearly described standards, so that we have a reasonable expectation that by the time someone's certified, they know how to do this well and safely. They know how to do it in a way that's linked to the research. And so that's one of our core strategies in the association is I would like to see within 5 years 1,000 trained and certified guides in the United States. In order to do that, we need to also train trainers. So we've described a path now. We have a clear path to certification, what's required to do that. And then for those who are certified and practice for a year or so, there's another extension of that path to possibly becoming trainers. And what I would like to see is something similar to what's in Japan. So in Japan right now, they have 5 training and certification centers in the islands. They're training and certifying 2 levels. So they have what they call the forest guide, who's someone who just leads walks. And then they have the forest therapist, who would be more like a nurse. And the difference between a therapist and a guide is, the guide is leading the walks and letting the forest do the work. And the therapist might be like a specific diagnosis and course of treatment involved and so on. So what we're calling is our group that we're training now, we're calling them certified forest therapy guides. We're not therapists, even though many of the people who train with us so far, a good percentage, have been people like psychotherapists and licensed social workers and so on. What I like to say is the guide opens the door or opens a series of doors, and the forest itself is the therapist. And that's what feels true to me, is that just through connecting with the forest, that's where the therapy comes from. But we need a guide to do that. So I'm often asked this question, and I also see it, in response to Facebook or blog posts. I'll see people say, why do I need a guide to do this? I know how to go walk in the woods. It's a no-brainer. My guess is that this way of walking in the woods may be possible for a very small percentage of people who are already, I would say they have to have a couple of things. They have to be very comfortable in nature, and they need to have some kind of solid mindfulness or meditative or contemplative practice. And if they're able to bring that together on their own when they're out in the woods, that's great. But for most people, what is likely to happen is you'll start with good intentions and then you'll find yourself hiking. And what a guide will do is a guide will slow you down and give you these really interesting, connective invitations and just kind of walk you through a series. And that's typically around 8 invitations per walk. People are really full, really energized after that. And if we stretch it to, let's give them 12, then something happens and they're not, it's not quite as positive.
You get that stressed out, worried look that you get when you're frantically trying to take photos of the plants.
Yeah.
Like, oh no.
You're frantically trying to have a connective experience. Yeah.
Exactly. The American way.
Right. As guides, we have to watch for that. Just, tell people, let it go. Let it go. When we see that stressed out look on the face, hey, let it go. Just enjoy being here.
You can always break into song and sing Frozen's Let It Go and see people running down the trail frantically trying to get away.
depending on the guide, song may be involved. So yes, some of the guides I work with just love singing, and that will happen sometimes.
And I love that. And no offense to Let It Go, the Frozen soundtrack, but my nieces, I've heard it probably 100 times. So Amos, we're getting to the end of our time together, and I just wanted to ask you, with all this research coming out and the benefits of being near the forest and nature therapy, what would you say if trees and the forest have such a beneficial impact? They have the potential to positively affect us in so many ways. What effect does deforestation have on us, would you say, on our psyches?
One of the very interesting fields of study are these large-scale epidemiological studies relating mortality indicators to deforestation. And no surprises, people who live in areas where, like if you study over a 20-year period, this was just done in the Pacific Northwest. There's a fairly recent study. It's on the website. People can find this, I'm pretty sure, on the Shinrin-yoku website. As the forests were reduced, people's mortality rates went in unhealthy directions. So there's, clear empirical evidence for this. I think that as a species, we have such a strong need for trees. I think that trees have a strong need for humans. They need us to be around them also. It's just my sense of it. I mean, if we all went away, the trees would all recover, and that would be great, but there might be a little bit of a sense of something missing there. One of the stories that I like is one of my friends who does these really kind of hardcore wilderness skills survival walks, talks about walking through the Pacific Northwest, for a week. You start with nothing except maybe buckskin clothes that you made yourself from deer that you killed and tanned the hides. They're that hardcore. Walking through the Northwest and finding it really hard to forage and to subsist on their own. Then going to the Kalahari Desert and walking with the Bushmen and realizing how incredibly rich and varied in this landscape that most of us would look at and say, wow, there's nothing to eat here, and just constant source of food. And the Bushman explanation for that is it's because humans are in relationship with the land. It's because we're tending the land. In our ethic here in the United States, we have the notion of wilderness, which is leave no trace behind. But that is not the indigenous way, the ways of indigenous people. The ways of indigenous people is a constant tending of the place, a constant breaking off a branch here if it's going to help the tree grow in a certain way, or trimming the roots if it's going to help this blackberry bush give better roots for baskets next year. Just this constant awareness as you're moving across the landscape. And so there's this thing that humans can do when we're in right relationship, where we can do little tending actions as we move through the landscape that's really good for the trees and really good for all the other species that are around us. And of course, we also know that when we lose forests, when deforestation happens, we get to a certain critical point, then deserts follow behind that. And so deforestation and desertification are two very intimately linked phenomena. Part of what I'm hoping will happen with people who come out and do forest therapy is that among the other benefits that they experience will also be a deepening love of forests, of nature, of their bioregion, the particular habitats that are within that bioregion, and everyone who lives there. I come back to what Jacques Cousteau said: people protect what they love. I want for as many people as possible to passionately love forests. Then we can protect them.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, if people want to contact you and find out more information, if you could repeat your website again, and also if they want to purchase your book, A Little Handbook of Shinrin-yoku, how can they find the book and find you?
Yeah, the book is on the websites. So either at shinrin-yoku.org or nftg.org. So you can order through either of those. Or if you go to Amazon and you type in Shinrin-yoku, it will be the Kindle version will be the top result on that. I think the hard copy is a lot nicer, but read the reviews on Amazon. They're really super positive. And it's just a short little book. It's only 40 pages. And so that means there's a high likelihood that you might actually read it. Yeah. And so
just don't read it on the trail.
Yeah, right. People tell me that they have a lot of fun with it because I kind of joke around in it a little bit. To get a hold of me, you can just get a hold of me through those websites. You can also just email me, Amos at natureandforesttherapy.org.
Great. And Amos, is there anything else that you want to add that I didn't ask you today, or or something you'd want listeners to know?
Yeah, I'd like people to know that we're doing trainings for guides in different places in the United States. We'll be doing a guide training in Girona, Spain, and in New Zealand, but the location isn't set yet in New Zealand. Meanwhile, anyone who wants to can go to the websites, either website, and just sign up on the interest form, and you'll be on the email. You'll get announcements for trainings that are coming up.
That is exciting. Wow.
Yeah, so this in 2015, we'll be doing a training here in Sonoma County in May. We'll be at Morton Arboretum, which is outside of Chicago, in the first part of June, and the second part of June we'll be at Hot Springs, North Carolina.
So Amos, thank you so much for talking with me today, and I can't wait to read more on your website. You have your blog, and I'm going to order your book as well.
Well, thank you, Jill. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you. Yeah, happy trails to you.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. You can find us online at sustainableworldradio.com and also on iTunes. For more information about permaculture and ecology, visit the Sustainable World Media YouTube channel, where you'll find videos about permaculture, aquaponics, organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and much, much more. Sustainable World Radio is a listener-supported program. If you like what we do, please consider making a donation to the show. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier, and thank you so much for listening.